The Bible is more than just a book of faith. It is also a record of history, a narrative that spans centuries and details the very events that shaped nations, cultures, and the future of humanity. For generations, skeptics dismissed these ancient accounts as mere myths, stories designed to explain natural phenomena. Tales of floods, fallen cities, wandering exiles, and the life of a man named Jesus Christ were all once viewed as fables. However, in the modern era, archaeology and science have begun to peel back the layers of time, revealing stunning evidence that confirms the biblical record. Psalm 119:160 affirms that, "The sum of your word is truth," and indeed, every discovery points to this profound reality. In the last century, as archaeologists have dug deeper into the earth and examined ancient records, they've uncovered relics that speak directly to the validity of these biblical stories. The testimony of the rocks, the ruins, and the inscriptions beneath our feet tells us that the Bible is more than just a spiritual guide. It is a reliable historical document. Today, we embark on a journey through 9 biblical events that not only shape our understanding of the past, but also offer hope and truth for our future. These events are not myths. They are confirmed by archaeology, history, and even science. And as we delve into the first of these events, the Great Flood of Noah, prepare yourself for a revelation that may change everything you thought you knew about ancient history. The story of Noah's flood is one of the most debated accounts in all of Scripture. For centuries, many believed it was a mere allegory, a story of divine wrath used to explain the natural disasters that have always occurred. Yet, as we delve into the archaeology of this ancient tale, we find evidence that challenges these old assumptions. This was no local flood. It was a cataclysmic event that reshaped the very earth and its inhabitants, one that humanity has not forgotten. Genesis 7:19 tells us, "The waters rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered." This passage does not describe a small, localized flood, but a global catastrophe that affected all of creation. And the more we explore, the more we find evidence that speaks to the universality of this memory. In the 1920s, British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley excavated the ancient city of Ur in Mesopotamia. Deep beneath the layers of civilization, he discovered a band of silt and clay that spanned over 8 feet thick. This layer, separated earlier settlements from later ones, was identified as a flood deposit, suggesting that a great inundation had occurred, wiping out entire populations and forcing civilization to begin anew. This wasn't just a seasonal rainfall, it was a violent, earth-shattering event. And this wasn't the only place where such a layer was found. Across Mesopotamia, other cities like Shuruppak and Kish also revealed similar flood deposits. But what makes this even more compelling is the evidence found in ancient texts. The Sumerian king list mentions a ruler named Ziusudra who survived a great flood, an eerily familiar tale to Noah's. Geologists have found even more fascinating evidence in the Black Sea region. Around 5000 BC, rising Mediterranean waters broke through the Bosporus Strait, causing a massive flood that rapidly expanded the Black Sea by thousands of square miles. Some scientists suggest that this regional event could have been the catalyst for the flood narrative that spread across many cultures. But the flood stories don't end there. They are told in over 270 cultures worldwide. In Sumerian and Babylonian texts, we find the story of Utnapishtim, the man who built an ark to survive a great flood. In Greek mythology, Zeus is said to have caused a flood to destroy humanity, saving only Deucalion and his wife, Pyrrha. In Native American cultures, the Hopi people recount a flood that reshaped the world. Even in China, the legend of Yu the Great speaks of a flood so devastating that it nearly wiped out mankind. From the Americas to Asia, across all corners of the globe, humanity remembers the Great Flood, each culture telling its own version of a chosen man or family saved from divine judgment by means of an ark or boat. What does this tell us? It tells us that the flood is not just a Jewish myth. It is a universal memory, etched deeply into the consciousness of mankind. Genesis 6:11-12 provides the biblical context for this flood, explaining that the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. The flood was not a random act of nature, but God's judgment on a world filled with sin and corruption. God saw the earth's wickedness and determined to start anew, saving only Noah, his family, and the creatures aboard the ark. But what about the ark itself? For centuries, skeptics mocked the idea that a wooden vessel large enough to carry 2 of every kind of animal could survive a global flood. Yet, modern engineers have confirmed the ark's feasibility. In the 1990s, researchers from the Korean Research Institute of Ships and Ocean Engineering calculated the ark's proportions based on the dimensions given in Genesis: 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. The results were astonishing. The ark's proportions are mathematically perfect for stability in rough seas. Not only that, but the flood account is preserved in the mountains of Ararat, where ancient traditions speak of a great wooden ship resting on the peak. Over the years, expeditions have reported finding unusual wooden structures buried in ice and rock, remains perhaps of the very ark that saved humanity from extinction. So, what can we conclude from all of this? The story of Noah's flood is not just a tale written in Genesis. It is a historical event validated by archaeological evidence, geological findings, and cultural traditions that span the globe. The Bible was right all along. God's judgment by water reshaped the earth, and through Noah, a remnant was preserved to begin anew. The flood, as it turns out, is not just a story of ancient times. It is a story that resonates through the ages, a reminder of both the destructive power of sin and the redemptive hope found in God's promise. Not long after the flood, as humanity began to repopulate the earth, a new story emerged, one of pride, rebellion, and divine judgment. This is the tale of the Tower of Babel, a symbol of humanity's first great act of defiance after the flood. According to Genesis 11:4, the people said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves." Their ambition was clear: to build a monument to human achievement, an expression of self-sufficiency, and a challenge to God's authority. But this wasn't just an architectural project. The Tower of Babel represented humanity's first organized attempt to unite against God's plan. Rather than spread across the earth as God had commanded, the people sought to centralize power in one place. They wanted to make a name for themselves without God. Archaeology has uncovered striking parallels to the Babel story in ancient Mesopotamia. Across the vast land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, archaeologists have unearthed massive stepped structures known as ziggurats. These towering monuments were not built as homes, but as religious centers dedicated to worshiping false gods. The most famous of these ziggurats was located in Babylon, in a city that would later become infamous for its pride and power. The Babylonian ziggurat, known as Etemenanke, was said to be so vast and towering that it seemed to pierce the heavens. In fact, the Greek historian Herodotus described Babylon's ziggurat in the 5th century BC, noting its 7 levels, each one taller than the last, reaching skyward with an almost heavenly grandeur. It was a city that prided itself on its might, its wisdom, and its independence, much like the people at Babel who built their tower to make a name for themselves. However, in the biblical story, something unexpected happened. In Genesis 11:7, God descended to see the tower and declared, "Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." Suddenly, the people could no longer communicate. What had been one unified society became fragmented, unable to work together. God had not only disrupted their prideful ambitions, but had scattered them across the earth, just as He had originally intended. This abrupt division of languages is not only found in the Bible, but is also supported by the science of linguistics. Modern research has shown that all human languages can be traced back to a common origin, and this great division in language occurred suddenly, not gradually. The Tower of Babel, therefore, was not just a physical structure, it was a representation of humanity's pride, and it was God's judgment upon that pride. But the story of Babel doesn't end with the scattering of the people. It is a cautionary tale, one that carries a profound lesson. Proverbs 16:18 tells us, "Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall." Babel stands as a warning that every time mankind tries to build a kingdom without God, whether through empires, ideologies, or technologies, the result is confusion and collapse. The tower was a futile attempt to reach the heavens, but in the end, it was God's power that scattered them, showing that humanity cannot achieve greatness apart from Him. In the centuries following the destruction of Babel, mankind would face another moment of judgment, one that would leave ruins and signs of divine wrath for generations to come. This judgment would come in the form of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, cities notorious for their immorality and wickedness. Their sins were so grievous that God could no longer allow them to stand. Genesis 19:24 records the terrifying moment when the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. For centuries, skeptics dismissed the destruction of these cities as nothing more than a legend, an exaggerated story meant to warn people against sin. But as archaeology has uncovered more evidence, the biblical account of divine judgment against these cities has begun to take shape in the physical landscape. One such site is Tal el-Ham, located to the northeast of the Dead Sea in modern-day Jordan. Excavations at this site have revealed a layer of ash and charred remains, suggesting that the city was consumed by intense heat and fire. Even more fascinating is the discovery of shocked quartz, a rare form of rock crystal that forms only under sudden, extreme pressure and heat. This same type of quartz has been found at nuclear test sites and meteor impact craters. In other words, the heat required to form this quartz is so intense that it could only have been caused by a cosmic event, a possible meteor or comet explosion in the sky. This would have caused a massive fireball, incinerating everything in its path, including the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Imagine the devastation. In a single moment, fire would have rained down from the heavens, walls would have collapsed, crops would have been destroyed, and people would have had no chance to escape. The destruction was complete, just as the Bible describes. And even today, the region surrounding the Dead Sea is barren and desolate, a stark reminder of the divine judgment that once fell upon these cities. In addition to the archaeological evidence, ancient historians such as the Jewish historian Josephus also recorded the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, referring to the area as still bearing the marks of fire and destruction. The early church fathers also referenced the ruins, using them as evidence of God's wrath against sin. But the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is more than just a historical account. It is a powerful reminder of God's holiness and justice. While He is merciful and patient, He will not allow sin to go unchecked forever. The destruction of these cities serves as both judgment and warning. Judgment on a society that had become corrupt and depraved, and a warning to future generations that God will not tolerate evil forever. In Matthew 11:24, Jesus Himself spoke of Sodom when He said, "But I tell you that it will be more bearable for Sodom on the day of judgment than for you." The ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah still stand as a testament to the consequences of sin and pride. They serve as a reminder that no matter how powerful or prosperous a society may seem, if it turns away from God, it will ultimately face destruction. The Tower of Babel and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah are linked by a common theme: pride and rebellion against God. Both stories speak to the danger of turning away from God and trying to achieve greatness apart from His will. They remind us that true unity, power, and success can only come through humility and submission to God's plan. The story of Joseph in Egypt is one of the most remarkable narratives in the Bible. It's a tale of betrayal, suffering, and redemption, a story that showcases how God can take what was meant for evil and turn it into good. Joseph, the son of Jacob, was sold into slavery by his jealous brothers, wrongfully imprisoned, and yet, by God's providence, he rose to become second only to Pharaoh in all of Egypt. Genesis 41:46 tells us that Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh. It was during this time of abundance that Joseph demonstrated his wisdom, foreseeing a coming famine and preparing Egypt for the years of scarcity. He stored vast amounts of grain during the 7 years of plenty, ensuring that Egypt would survive the 7 years of famine that followed. But did this remarkable rise really happen? Was there any historical basis for Joseph's ascent to power in Egypt? Archaeology offers some fascinating insights. In Egypt's Fium region, archaeologists have uncovered enormous grain silos built during the Middle Kingdom period, designed to store grain for times of crisis. These silos were not just for daily consumption, but for massive reserves, just as described in the Bible. In addition to these grain silos, there's evidence of a large Semitic population in Egypt during the Middle Kingdom. Excavations at Avaris, an ancient city in the Nile Delta, uncovered the tomb of a high-ranking official who is thought to have been a foreigner. This official's tomb contained a statue of a man with light skin, red hair, and a multicolored coat, resembling the very description of Joseph in the Bible. The tomb, however, was mysteriously found empty, no bones, no remains. Some scholars believe that this could be a sign that Joseph's body was taken by the Israelites when they later fled Egypt, fulfilling his dying wish for his bones to be carried with them when they left. The Bible also mentions that Joseph was given the title Zaphanath-Paneah, which some scholars believe is connected to the Egyptian phrase meaning the revealer of secrets. This title is particularly significant because it corresponds to Joseph's role as an interpreter of Pharaoh's dreams that foretold the coming famine. Interestingly, Egyptian records mention officials who were tasked with storing grain during times of famine, roles that align closely with Joseph's responsibilities in the biblical narrative. Further corroborating the biblical account, inscriptions from neighboring regions, such as Canaan, mention periods of famine around the same time Joseph would have lived. These records describe food shortages, prompting people to migrate in search of sustenance. It's no coincidence that Joseph's brothers, driven by famine, traveled to Egypt to buy grain, just as the Bible describes in Genesis 42:5-6. Joseph, now the governor of the land, recognized them, but they did not recognize him, fulfilling his earlier dreams of his brothers bowing down to him. Yet, Joseph's story is more than a historical account. It is a testimony to God's providence. Genesis 50:20 reveals the heart of the story when Joseph says to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph's rise to power in Egypt was not just for personal gain, but to preserve the line of promise through which the Messiah would one day come. While Joseph's story may have seemed like a tale of personal triumph over adversity, it also serves as a critical turning point in the history of God's people. His role in Egypt ensured the survival of his family during a time of great famine, preserving the lineage through which the Israelites would eventually rise to prominence. In a sense, Joseph was a precursor to the great deliverance that would come centuries later through another leader, Moses. As we transition from Joseph's rise in Egypt, we turn our attention to one of the most defining moments in Israel's history, the Exodus. The Exodus is the story of God's miraculous deliverance of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, a moment of freedom that would become a cornerstone of their identity as a people. But, like Joseph's story, the Exodus too has been subject to skepticism. Did the Israelites truly leave Egypt in the dramatic fashion described in the Bible? Archaeology provides compelling evidence that the Exodus, while extraordinary, may have been rooted in historical reality. Textual evidence from Egypt itself hints at a time of crisis and upheaval during the reign of Pharaoh Merneptah, son of Ramses II. The Ipuwer Papyrus, a text from the 19th dynasty, describes an Egypt struck by disasters, rivers turning to blood, widespread destruction, death, and pestilence. These descriptions mirror the plagues that struck Egypt, as recorded in Exodus. Skeptics have long questioned the possibility of the Israelites crossing the Red Sea, but recent studies suggest that such an event might not be as impossible as it seems. Some scientists propose that a strong east wind could have temporarily exposed a land bridge in the Red Sea, allowing the Israelites to cross on dry ground, exactly as the Bible describes in Exodus 14:29. In fact, computer models from the National Center for Atmospheric Research have shown that a sustained wind of 60 millworms could have pushed the waters back for several hours, allowing for a miraculous crossing. In addition to these scientific studies, there have been reports of unusual underwater structures and coral formations in the Red Sea that resemble ancient pathways, with objects resembling chariot wheels and axles found at the seabed. While the findings remain debated, they fuel the possibility that remnants of Pharaoh's army, who pursued the Israelites into the sea, may indeed lie buried beneath the waters. But perhaps the most undeniable evidence comes from the Merneptah Stele, an Egyptian monument from the 13th century BC, which contains the earliest mention of Israel outside the Bible. The stela describes Israel as a people already settled in Canaan, confirming that by the late 13th century BC, Israel was in the Promised Land, just as the Bible states. The story of the Exodus is more than just an event in history. It is a powerful testament to God's faithfulness in keeping His promises. He promised Abraham that his descendants would be enslaved in a foreign land, and He kept that promise by delivering them out of Egypt with a mighty hand. As the Israelites left Egypt, they took with them the bones of Joseph, fulfilling his final wish and ensuring that the memory of God's work in Egypt would endure for generations to come. The Exodus is also a living story celebrated by Jews around the world during Passover. Every year, the story is retold to remind the Jewish people of God's deliverance and His unbroken covenant with His people. As we look back at Joseph's rise and the Exodus, we see how God's hand was at work in history, preparing His people for the future, one that would eventually lead to the coming of Jesus Christ, the ultimate deliverer. After the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings, the Israelites finally arrived at the Promised Land, a land flowing with milk and honey, but also filled with fortified cities and powerful enemies. The first city they encountered was Jericho, a city whose walls were so thick and tall that no army could have breached them. Yet, the Israelites didn't rely on their military strength to bring the walls down. Instead, they obeyed God's command and marched around the city for 7 days, blowing trumpets and shouting, as recorded in Joshua 6:20. When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. The destruction of Jericho, like much of the Bible's miraculous events, has been the subject of skepticism. How could the walls of a city so well fortified simply collapse? Archaeology, however, has provided some fascinating insights into the story. In the 1930s, British archaeologist John Garstang uncovered evidence that the city's walls had collapsed in a way that was unusual for siege warfare. Rather than falling inward, as would be expected during an attack, the walls of Jericho fell outward, creating a natural ramp for the Israelites to charge straight into the city. Garstang also found layers of burned debris and ash, clear evidence that the city was consumed by fire, just as Joshua 6:24 states, "Then they burned the whole city and everything in it." Even more striking was the discovery of large storage jars filled with grain. This suggests that the city fell quickly before its inhabitants could consume their harvest, further confirming that Jericho's destruction occurred during the spring harvest, as the Bible describes. What's even more remarkable is that the Israelites did not plunder the food, but instead destroyed the city in obedience to God's command. Later excavations by Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s raised doubts about the dating of the destruction of Jericho, claiming the city's walls had fallen centuries before the biblical timeline. However, recent studies have re-examined Kenyon's findings, and many archaeologists now argue that her conclusions overlooked key pottery fragments that match the biblical period. The growing consensus among scholars is that the destruction of Jericho aligns with the Late Bronze Age, the very period when the Israelites would have entered Canaan. The fall of Jericho is more than just a military victory. It is a powerful testimony to God's faithfulness and power. As Hebrews 11:30 reminds us, by faith the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. The Israelites didn't bring down the walls, God did, and in doing so, he demonstrated that no fortress of man can stand against his will. As Israel's story unfolds, we move from the miraculous victory at Jericho to the reign of King David, one of the most significant figures in the Bible. David was a shepherd, a warrior, a poet, and ultimately the king through whom God promised the Messiah would come. For centuries, skeptics doubted David's existence, dismissing him as a legendary figure, a character created to glorify Israel's past. However, archaeology has provided irrefutable evidence that David was not a myth, but a real king who founded a dynasty that would last for generations. In 1993, archaeologists uncovered a broken basalt stone at Tel Dan in northern Israel. The inscription, written in ancient Aramaic, boasted of military victories over Israel and Judah, and there, in bold letters, were the words Beit David, the house of David. This discovery was revolutionary. For the first time outside the pages of the Bible, David's name appeared in stone, confirming that the dynasty of David was not just a legend, but a historical reality. Prior to this, many scholars had argued that David was merely a tribal chieftain, but the Tel Dan stela changed that perception, proving that by the 9th century BC, the name of David and his dynasty was known even to foreign kings. The Mechelin stone, another artifact dating to the same period, also references the House of David, providing further evidence of his historical existence. With these discoveries, the biblical account of David's reign, his rise to power, his battles, his establishment of Jerusalem as the political and spiritual center of Israel, has been validated by archaeology. David's life was far from perfect, marked by both triumphs and failures. Yet, through it all, God established him as Israel's greatest king, a man after God's own heart. His story is significant not only for his accomplishments but also for the promise that God made to him, that his descendant would rule forever. This promise would be fulfilled in Jesus Christ, who was born in David's city, Bethlehem, and who would establish an eternal kingdom. From David's kingdom, we move to the tragic fall of Israel, which came with the Babylonian exile. The fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC was one of the darkest moments in Israel's history. For centuries, God had warned his people through the prophets to turn away from sin and idolatry. Yet, the people of Judah refused to repent, and as a result, God allowed Babylon, the superpower of the day, to bring judgment upon them. The story of the exile is recorded in 2 Kings 25:1. In the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his entire army. The Babylonians tore down the city walls, burned the Temple of Solomon, and carried off the treasures from the sanctuary.